Let's take a look at the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So for some perspective, this is going to be the right hemisphere. This will be the corpus callosum. Here is the cerebellum with the arbor vitae. And here is the, brainstem, good. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, spinal cord. And how do you tell? Because that's a central canal. Here is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and we have a blow up of that right here. So here's the hypothalamus, that little tiny powerhouse of the nervous system. And here's the pituitary. Pituitary is attached to the hypothalamus by what's known as the infundibulum. So what happens is this. There are actually going to be axons from the hypothalamus that are within the infundibulum, which will terminate in the posterior pituitary, and that's going to be very important. In the next section, we'll talk about that relationship more. Notice that the pituitary has lobes. It actually has 3 lobes, but there's a middle lobe that nobody really knows the function of, so we pretend it doesn't exist for this class and many classes. The 2 lobes you do need to know about are the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, which are both indicated there. So, review. Pituitary is going to be attached to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum, that stalk-like thing. It does sit within the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, and there are 2 distinct lobes. The anterior pituitary, another name for that is adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary, and another name for that is neurohypophysis. And I used to remember adeno starts with A, so that's going to be the anterior one. And posterior, you actually have axons of the hypothalamus terminating in the posterior pituitary. So axons are nervous tissue, so neuro, there you go. That's what worked for me. We're going to, in this section, discuss the anterior pituitary. So there it is. Take a look at the picture on the left, and you will see that there are blood vessels, or a series of blood vessels, all around the most inferior or distal part of the hypothalamus, the infundibulum, and the anterior pituitary. That's going to be very important. You'll also see that the hypothalamus has hypothalamic neurons. And I put this micrograph of the anterior pituitary here because you need to know that the anterior pituitary looks sort of very densely packed. It kind of looks cellular or glandular. That's going to be important. Remember that. So those blood vessels that are around the infundibulum and pituitary are part of what is known as the hypophysial portal system. Hypophysial portal system. Hypophys for hypothalamus. It's one of 3 portal systems. Can you figure out what the other 2 are? That's what Google is for. It's going to be important. The hypophysial portal system is going to be important because it's actually connecting the hypothalamus and the pituitary together. It's a series of parallel capillaries, which is going to provide the blood vessels that we need in order to get the hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary quickly and efficiently. So, as it says, hormones secreted by the hypothalamus are carried to the target cells in the adenohypophysis, anterior pituitary, by those blood vessels before they get shipped off to general circulation and then have to travel all the way around your body in order to find their way back to the anterior pituitary. Instead, they're secreted into here, they're carried to here, and they're released from here. So much simpler. These are the hormones that you need to know, and there are some pathologies that we haven't discussed, but you need to know, so there's a refresher on them. Growth hormone, TSH, ACTH, prolactin, FSH, and luteinizing hormone. We're going to go over each of those. And yes, you need to know the functions. So take note. Hypothalamus, pituitary, and that just is telling you the same info as the last slide. It's just in images, so people who are more visually oriented have that information in order to help synthesize the info themselves. Growth hormone, it does exactly what it says it's going to do. It's also known as somatotropin. It controls growth when you talk about the skeletal system, and it's going to do that because it's going to affect the rate of protein synthesis. So it's going to stimulate cell growth and reproduction. It's going to accelerate that rate of protein synthesis. It is going to target muscle cells and chondrocytes, as well as epithelium, connective tissue, including adipose tissue, and our friend the liver. Pathologies. Dwarfism. If you are a pituitary dwarf, you have insufficient growth hormone. Growth of your bones will be slow, and your epiphyseal plates, your growth plates, will seal early. The individual has normal proportions. They are just tiny. It is unlikely in developed countries that you will see pituitary dwarfs, because these conditions are usually caught early now and can be treated. This is more common in emerging nations. So how are they treated? Growth hormone injections, which can actually be administered at home. There are some side effects, no surprise: fluid retention, muscle pain, joint pain. You need to know the difference between pituitary dwarfism and a chondroplastic dwarfism. Again, we went over this in 131, so this is a refresher. When you talk about a chondroplastic dwarfism, remember, you're looking for chondro in that. A chondro has to do with cartilage. So sure enough, the hyaline cartilage in long bones, that hyaline cartilage model does not form properly and does not develop into bone properly. It is a genetic disorder. And in 80% of the patient, it's actually due to a spontaneous mutation of a specific gene. You don't need to know the gene, but there it is in case you want to know it. And 20% of the time, it is inherited. When you talk about chondroplastic dwarfs, they tend to have a large head with a somewhat prominent forehead. They'll have a normal-sized torso, and their arms and legs, their extremities, will be short. So let's take a look at that versus this. Pituitary dwarfism, the person is in proportion just tiny. In a chondroplastic dwarfism, normal-sized torso, somewhat larger head, short extremities. On the opposite scale of that is gigantism, which is hypersecretion of GH while the growth plates are open. That will trigger an abnormal increase in the length of bones. There are a slew of additional symptoms: hyperhidrosis, headaches, sleep disorders, delay of puberty, muscle weakness, and over the long term, diabetes and heart disease. And that is because, particularly heart disease, the heart can actually not pump enough, hard enough, fast enough, long enough to supply really large bodies if you have gigantism. Remember, gigantism is when this occurs when the growth plates are open. Acromegaly is hypersecretion of growth hormone after the growth plate has sealed. Bones of the hand, the feet, the face, and the jaw thicken. Soft tissues will also grow. And there are long-term effects, which include about a quarter of the patients end up with diabetes. And also you're going to have cardiomyopathy. And this shows you the progression. And these are often associated, acromegaly is often associated with a pituitary tumor. And in developed countries, it tends to be caught pretty quickly these days. So you're not going to see this as often. Emerging nations, less so. it's caught less and treated less. So normal features, and you can see over time what happens with the features. Same with this guy. You see that his features are definitely changing because of acromegaly. And just another diagram which tells you what's happened. Just the right amount of GH, too little GH, too much GH. Thyroid stimulating hormone, abbreviated TSH, also known as thyrotropin. It is released in response to the hormone that is released by the hypothalamus, which is known as thyroid releasing hormone. This hormone will target the thyroid gland and will control secretions of the hormones that are produced and secreted from the thyroid. Triiodothyronine, which is T3, and thyroxine, which is T4. If you have excessive TSH or too little TSH, you may end up with a goiter. Kind of paradoxical. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, HCTH, we've already talked about that when we talked about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. HCTH is going to be secreted by the anterior pituitary and will control the secretion of hormones that are secreted by the adrenal cortex. So its target is the adrenal cortex, which is the outermost portion of the adrenal gland. Prolactin is important because it's going to stimulate milk production. In women, in men, they're not really sure what it does. But if you have excess production, if you are male, then you're going to decrease production of your male sex hormones, testosterone, and actually can cause fertility. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. What it does is going to depend on what your gender is. In females, it's going to stimulate the maturation of the ovarian follicle and the ovum. It will also trigger the release of estrogen from the ovary. In males, it's going to stimulate the production and maturation of sperm within the testes. You need to know both those functions. Yes, you do. It's a gonadotropin, which means it's going to target primary sex organs, i.e. the ovaries or the testes in males or females. Last but not least, when it comes to the anterior pituitary, we have luteinizing hormone, and what it does will depend on what your gender is. In females, it triggers ovulation. In males, it triggers the release of testosterone. It is also a gonadotropin because it targets its primary sex organs, the ovaries or the testes.